The sound behind the door. KeanuReeves was not the kind of man you expected to find, with a wrench in his hand and water dripping onto his shirt. But today he was exactly. They had arrived at the small cottage at the edge of the hills just past noon. The sun was soft, the clouds drifting like lazy whispers. Across the sky, the house belonged to a woman named Elena. Hart. Keanu had never met her before. He had only received a letter. It was handwritten, shaky ink on a pale blue page that smelled faintly of lavender. Dear Mr. Reeves, I don't know me, but I know you. I saw you once in town. You helped an old man whose groceries had fallen in the street, and I watched how gentle you were, how you smiled without asking for anything. Me sink is broken, and I have no one left to help. If you could please come, I would be very grateful. Sincerely, Elena. Hart. There was no number, just an address written in small cursive letters. Keanu had read it twice, then 3 more times, and something about it stayed with him. So he drove there in his old truck, with his toolbox on the seat beside him, and knocked on the door. But no one answered. Headway. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, but the kind of silence that made your skin feel cold even in the summer. Knocked again. Nothing. Tried the door, and to his surprise, it creaked open. Called out, "Hello, Miss Hart, are you okay?" No reply. Keanu stepped inside. The living room was dim, the curtains were drawn, and dust floated in the air like tiny spirits. Furniture was old, but neat. A small couch, a rocking chair, an old lamp with a tilted shadian. The kitchen floor, a small puddle had formed under the sink. Keanu took a breath, crouched down, and began his work. It was an easy fix, a loose pipe and worn out washer. As he tightened the last bolt, he noticed something odd. A piece of paper had slipped down behind the cabinet just beside the sink. It was folded twice, stained with a coffee ring. Pulled it out slowly, unfolded it, and read the words, "Please call 911. He's coming back." Keanu Reeves looked around the kitchen, his ears suddenly alert to every creak in the floorboards. Every breath of wind against the window. Stood up slowly, scanning the room again. The note was written in the same shaky hand as the letter. His heart beat harder. Was she in danger? Was he to let Keanu place the note in his jacket and walked deeper into the house. Moved slowly, calling out, "Elena, my name is Keanu. I'm here to help." The hallway was narrow-lined with faded pictures of a younger Elena smiling beside a man whose face was scratched out in every frame. At the end of the hall was a closed door. Behind it came a soft sound, a whisper maybe, or a cry. He couldn't tell. He knocked gently. No answer. Keanu slowly turned. The handle door creaked open, revealing a small bedroom. Elena was sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to him, her hair long and dark, and unbrushed, was trembling. Keanu stepped closer and said softly, "Elena." Turned. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying. When she saw him, she gasped, but didn't scream. Instead, she whispered, "Did he send you?" Keanu shook his head. "No, ma'am, I came because of your letter." Elena looked confused. Then her eyes fell to his hand and saw the note. She reached out and grabbed it from him, her hands shocking. He thought no one would come, she said. Keanu sat down on the floor in front of her, not wanting to frighten her more. "Well, is he asked gently. Elena's voice cracked as she spoke. "Me ex-husband, he used to live here with me. He was kind once, but then he changed after the accident. He blamed me for everything. He started hitting me. Got away one night when he passed out drunk, and I thought it was over, but 2 weeks ago I saw him in town. Followed me home. Has been watching the house. I hear things at night, scratching, tapping, sometimes whispering. Last night someone tried the back door." Keanu listened closely, his hands curling into fists. Slowly looked at her, eyes full of pain and fear, and knew she wasn't lying. "Have you called the police?" He sketch nodded, but said they never find anything. "And I have no proof," he said, "without evidence. It's just paranoia." Keanu stood up. "We're going to the station now. You'll be safe." But Elena didn't move. Comes during the day, she whispered. Is smart. He watches from the trees. He waits." Keanu walked to the window and pulled the curtain. A city, a thick forest surrounded the house. Stared into the shadows. It felt like something was watching them. "We'll get you somewhere safe," Keanu said, but before they could leave, there was a knock on the front door. It wasn't loud, just 3 soft knocks, like someone being polite. Keanu turned to Elena, who had gone pale again. "That's how he knocks," she whispered. Keanu took a breath, his mind racing, reached for his phone, but there was no signal. He glanced at the door again. 3 more knocks, lower this time, and moved to the kitchen. Quietly picked up a heavy wrench and turned back to Elena. "Stay here no matter." Waith moved down the hall, heart-pounding footsteps, soft but ready. When he reached the door, He looked through the peephole. A man in a cap and thick coat stood outside, his head low, like he was hiding his face. Keanu didn't open the door. Spoke loud enough for the man to hear. You need to leave right now. The man didn't move. Keanu waited. Then the man smiled without raising his head and whispered through the door, "She's mine. You can't take her." Keanu's blood ran cold. He yelled, "Get away or I will call the police." The man looked up and his eyes were empty like glass. Then he backed away slowly into the trees until he was gone. Keanu locked the door and ran back to Elena. He helped her pack a small bag and they left the house through the back door, rushing to his truck parked at the end of the narrow road. As they drove, Keanu looked into the mirror again and again just to be sure. They reached the police station within the hour. Elena gave her full statement. Keanu handed over the note. The officer listened and finally said, "You were lucky he didn't get in, but we'll send someone to watch the place just in case." That night, Elena stayed at a safe house. Keanu checked in on her twice and made sure she had food, blankets, and a working phone. But as he left that night, he knew it wasn't over. Had seen something in the man's eyes, something that told him this story was far from finished. Ed would not let her face it alone. Not now, not ever. Fixed her sink, but maybe, just maybe, he was meant to fix more than they just didn't know how deep this story would go. At asterisk. The man in the trees. Keanu Reeves couldn't sleep that night, even though he had returned to his own quiet home, far from the forest, far from the cottage. The image of the man's smile at the door haunted his mind. There was something in that smile, something to calm, to confident. It wasn't the look of a man who had been scared away. It was the look of someone who had just begun to play a long, cruel game. Next morning, Keanu returned to the police station to check on Elena. She looked better, her hair combed, her face rested, but her hands still trembled when she held the warm cup of tea the officer had given her. "Thank you for not leaving," she said softly, as Keanu sat beside her in the waiting room. Keanu nodded. "I said I'd help." She looked around, then whispered, "I had a dream last night. Was standing in the woods again." He didn't speak, he just watched it, and then he stepped forward through the glass. Keanu didn't know what to say at first, so he simply placed his hand gently over her. "You were not alone now." The officer who had taken her statement walked over and cleared his throat. "Went to the house," he said. "No signs of forced entry, but we did find fresh footprints around the back door. Big boots, heavy ones. Looks like someone's been circling for days." He looked at Elena, then at Keanu. "We've put in a request for patrol, but we don't have the resources to guard that place full time unless there's another incident." Keanu stood up. "I'll stay there." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You, sir?" Keanu nodded firmly. "I've been in worse situations." He won't let her go back there alone. Elena looked at him, her eyes wide. "Are you sure?" He smiled gently. "Yes, but before that I need to stop somewhere." Elena stayed at the safe house for the day, while Keanu drove back into town or stopped at a hardware store, bought cameras, motion sensors, floodlights, a stronger deadbolt, and a generator just in case. He packed everything into the back of his truck and made his way back to the cottages. The sun dipped lower. The shadows of the forest stretched longer across the yard like dark fingers. Keanu worked fast, installed the lights round the porch and trees, set up motion detectors near the back door and windows, tested the locks twice inside. He cleaned the kitchen, fixed the broken curtain rod, and made sure every room had a flashlight. When Elena arrived just after sunset, she hesitated at the door, but when she stepped in and saw what Keanu had done, she let out a slow breath. "You made it feel safe again," she said. Keanu gave a small smile. "It's not perfect, but it's better than before." They ate a simple dinner together, sandwiches and soup. Elena told him stories about her garden, how she used to grow lavender and sunflowers, how her life used to be peaceful. Told her about his quiet days, about how helping others gave him a strange kind of calm. When the clock struck midnight, Elena finally said good night and went to her room. Keanu stayed in the living room on the couch, with the wrench still close. The house creaked softly, but nothing unusual until the 17 amp floodlight outside blinked on. Keanu sat up instantly alert, moved to the window, and peeked through the curtain. A shape stood near the tree. Lena too, still to be an animal. Keanu stepped outside carefully, keeping to the shadows. The man didn't move. Stood just like in Elena's dream, watching silent like. Keanu took one step forward and called out, "What do you want?" The man didn't reply, but he lifted his hand and pointed to the house. Keanu's stomach turned cold. He didn't yell again. He simply stepped back inside, locked the door, and checked the monitors. The man didn't come closer. He stayed for nearly an hour, then turned and disappeared into the woods the next morning. Keanu didn't tell Elena everything, but he did say someone had come back. She didn't seem surprised. Just Scaretti knew he wouldn't stop. Keanu called the police again, but they said without a break-in or clear threat there wasn't much they could do. Elena looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. Used to say if I ever left him he'd make sure I was never safe again. Keanu reached for her hand. He leaned, but in his heart he knew the man wasn't going to stop. Later that afternoon, Keanu decided to search the woods. Walked for hours marking the trees. As he went, found empty food wrappers, an old boot print, and a torn piece of dark fabric snagged on a branch. Simeon had been living nearby. Followed the trail deeper until he found a small clearing hidden between thick oaks. There was a torn tent, a burnt-out fire, and a few bottles of cheap liquor. Keanu took photos with his phone and made a mental note of everything. Then he heard a branch snap, turned fast, but saw nothing. Still, he felt it. Simeon had been close, watching him again. He walked back to the house faster this time, every sound behind him sharper. That night he set up more cameras, but as the clock moved toward midnight again something changed. The motion sensor didn't blink, but the back door handle began to turn slowly. Keanu crept to the kitchen and waited. The handle jiggled again, more forcefully this time. Then stopped it. Ran outside, but again the man was already gone. Elena found him in the backyard, staring into the woods. Said you should leave. He shook his head. I'm not leaving until this ends. But how will it end, she asked. Keanu looked at the trees and whispered, well, find a way. As he said that, a crow flew overhead and dropped something from its beak. It landed near his feet, a small curiosity, old worn. Elena stared at it and said softly, it's the key to the old basement, but I haven't used it in years. Keanu bent down and picked it up. Would a bird have this? He asked. Elena shrugged, pale and confused, but her eyes suddenly changed. Maybe it wasn't the bird that left it. Keanu nodded, then said, we're opening it tomorrow. Cows, whatever this man wants, Mabe. It's not just you, Mabe, it's something else. Mabe, it's something buried. Asterisk. The key to what was buried. Morning came with a thin fog hugging the trees and a cold wind that seemed to whisper through the cracks of the cottage. KeanuReeves stood at the back door, the rusty key still in his hand. It felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than metal and time. Elena stood beside him, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes full of dread. He haven't gone down there since he left, she said. Keanu looked at her gently. You don't have to come with me. She shook her head. I need to know. They walked to the side of the house where a small wooden hatch sat buried under a layer of dirt and moss. Keanu brushed the debris away, revealing a thick iron lock that hadn't been touched in years. Inserted the key. It turned slowly with a long groan and then clicked open. Pulled the hatch open. The smell of damp wood and earth wafting up a narrow set of stairs led into darkness. Keanu turned on his flashlight and led the way. Elena followed, each step creaking beneath them. The basement was small, the walls made of old stone, the air thick, and heavy. Boxes were stacked in the corners, covered with tarps and cobwebs. But what caught Keanu's eye was the chalk circle drawn in the center of the floor. Inside it sat a broken music box, its lid open, a small ballerina frozen mid-spin. What is this? Keanu asked quietly. Elena's voice was weak. Used to sit down here for hours, said it helped him think, but one night he came upstairs and said he had seen something in the shadows. After that he started changing, stopped talking to people, started locking this place up and keeping the key with him at all times. Keanu stepped into the circle and picked up the music box. It played a faint off-tune melody before stopping again. He turned back to Elena, who looked pale. Said something lived down here, she whispered. Something that fed on fire. Keanu placed the box down and began opening the dusty crates around the room. Found notebooks filled with drawings of eyes watching from darkness, symbols he didn't recognize. Faces repeated over and over. Belongs to the shadow. Found photos to pictures of Elena taken from outside the house when she didn't know. Keanu's hands tightened. This wasn't just obsession, this was something dark. Here he heard a sound behind him and turned fast, but it was only a spider falling from the ceiling. Elena said, we shouldn't be down here. Keanu agreed, and they left quickly, locking the hatch behind them. Later that afternoon, Keanu went into town and found a local historian named Martha who ran a small bookstore near the library. She was old, sharp, and always curious. Showed her the drawings and the symbols. Her eyes widened. These are protection sigils, she said. Very oldest to trap things. Keanu frowned. Trap? Which hesitated, then whispered, There are stories around here about a man who moved into that house many years ago. Claimed his wife had been taken by a thing in the woodside. It whispered her name. He drew symbols all over the house. But one night he disappeared, and when people went to check, the basement was locked, and no one could find the key. Keanu said softly, I think his spirit stayed or something else did. Martha looked up at him. You need to be careful. Some people go looking for truth and find something else. Something that looks back. Keanu thanked her and returned to the cottage. Al found Elena on the porch holding the music box. Said it started playing on its own. Keanu checked it again, but it looked normal, just old and broken. He stayed outside most of the day. As night fell, the forest began to breathe again. Wind in the leaves, shadows dancing between trees, but tonight it felt worse. More Alavek. Keanu checked the camera's motion detected at the edge of the property. Zoomed in. The man in the coat was back, this time closer, not hiding, just standing by the tree with the broken branch. Elena walked up behind him, saw the screen, and whispered, he knows. We opened the basement. Keanu nodded. This isn't about hurting you anymore, it's about stopping us. Lights flickered on Seth and came back. Keanu stepped outside, wrench in hand, flashlight in the other, moved slow, watching the trees, but the man was gone. Circled the house twice, then returned inside. But when he walked into the kitchen, he Frizev music box was open on the table, spinning slowly. Elena stood near the doorway. I didn't bring it in. Keanu closed it gently and whispered, did. That night they didn't sleep. Every time they closed their eyes, the music started again. Be morning. Keanu made a decision. We're digging what she skied in the basement. Want something down there, we're going to find it. They returned to the basement with tools. Keanu used chalk to redraw the old symbols on the wall just in Casithan. He began digging in the center of the circle for hours, nothing but dirt and stone. But just before sunset, his shovel hit with a box about the size of a small chest. He pulled it out slowly. It was sealed shut with nails and wax. Opened it carefully. Inside were three things: a photo of Elena as a chilled a page with the same symbols from the basement, and a black envelope with no name. Keanu opened the envelope. Inside was a letter. You think you saved her, but she was never yours. To Savesh is Minith Forest chose Hirsch. Heard the calend. I answered. Keanu looked at Elena, whose hands were shaking. This was never just a stalk. This was something deeper. Put the box aside and say to burn it all tonight when this is. The sun dipped below the trees. Keanu gathered firewood in the yard, placed the box, the envelope, the photo, and everything from the basement into a metal drum. Elena stood beside him holding a lit match. Together they dropped it in. Fire roared, and for a moment they felt peace. But then the wind changed. Trees swayed harder, and from the edge of the woods came a low growl. Not an animal, not human, but something else. Elena whispered his hair. But when Keanu looked at it, wasn't the man in the coat. It was something much older with eyes that burned like embers. The thing that watched the fire still burned in the metal drum, its light flickering against the trees like a warning signal. In the night, KeanuReeves stood frozen beside Elena, his eyes locked on the figure standing just beyond the edge of the clear. Injet was no longer the man in the coathas, was something different, and its form was tall but not human. Its skin looked like bark and ash, its limbs too long for its frame, and its eyes glowed orange like dying coals in a fireplace. Wind died down. Night went completely still. Not even the crickets dared to sink. Keanu whispered slowly, go inside. Elenash didn't move. Ash stared at the creature, unable to breath. Height didn't come closer, but it didn't leave either. Keanu moved between it and Elena, gripping the old wrench in his hand, though deep inside he knew it would do nothing against whatever this was. After a long silent moment, the figure stepped backward into the woods and vanished into the darkness. Keanu and Elena ran inside, bolted the doors, and shut the curtains. Elena dropped onto the couch, gasping. What was that? She asked, her voice shaking. Keanu sat beside her. I don't know, but I think we just woke something up. Elena stood and walked to the table where the music box sat again. Closet stared at it, then whispered, used to say the forest listens, that if you whisper to the trees long enough they start whispering back. Keanu rubbed his temples and stood. We're not staying here tonight. They packed a few things and drove back to town, to a small motel near the highway. Keanu called the police again and explained what they had seen. That when the officer came by and checked the property, all he found were deer tracks. No man, no creature, no sign of anything unusual. Keanu didn't argue, simply said thank you and hung up. Back at the motel, Elena couldn't sleep. She sat in the chair near the window, staring out into the parking lot. Keanu handed her a cup of tea and asked, do you think he's still watching? She nodded. I don't think he ever stopped. The next day, Keanu returned alone to the bookstore. To find Martha he showed her the burned letter, the page with the symbols, and described what they had seen. Martha's face went pale. "You shouldn't have burned it," she said. Keanu frowned. "Why not? Some boxes are meant to stay shut. Those symbols weren't just for protection, they were binding. She might have released something. Old Keanu sighed, then said quietly, "How do I stop it?" Martha opened a thick book and flipped through pages until she landed on a passage about forest spirits. Some called them watchers, some called them shades, beings that lingered between worlds and fed off memory pain, and further marked pulsametims by blood, sometimes by obsession, and they always returned to reclaim what they believed was theirs. She handed him a page with a ritual. It was simple but dangerous, a cleansing stone at the source where the first whisper was hard. Keanu asked, "Where would that be?" Martha looked at him. "Where he first changed." Keanu returned to Elena and told her everything. She sat still for a moment, then whispered, "It was the night I told him I was leaving. He disappeared into the forest for hours. When he came back, he was different. He started calling me by someone else's name. He said he had made a deal." Keanu said, "Then that's where we go." Elena looked terrified, but nodded. "You'll go with youth." At evening they returned to the first, not to the house, but deeper. Elena guided Keanu past the clearing, past the burned-out fire pit, and down a hidden trail behind the hills. After nearly an hour they found an old stone altar, half buried in moss and bowls carved into the rocks, symbols that matched the drawings. Keanu cleared the brush around it while Elena opened the small bag Martha had given them. Inside were herbs, salt, chalk, and a candle. Keanu read the ritual aloud. In a steady voice, placed the herbs around the altar, poured a circle of salt, and lit the candle in the center. Then Elena placed the music box in the middle. They spoke the final words. The wind picked up trees groaned. The candle flickered, but didn't go out, and then the box began to spin. It opened slowly, the melody playing, but this time the sound was sharp, painful, like metal scraping against glass. Elena clutched her head, crying out. Keanu reached for her, but his hands passed through her like mist. This vision blurred, the world tilted, and suddenly he was alone. The forest had changed. No more wind, no more sound, just stillness. Looked down and saw he was standing inside the chalk circle. He called out, "Elena." No answer. Then he heard footsteps behind him, slow, heavy. He turned and saw the man again, but not as he was before. This time his face was smooth like clay, his mouth sewn shut, his eyes empty sockets that wept black tears. Pointed at Keanu, then placed his hand over his chest and whispered, without moving his lips, "I took her." Canoe stepped forward. "Who are you?" But the man just shook his head and repeated, "'Twas Minnie who took her." Then he lunged forward, and everything went black. When Keanu opened his eyes, he was back at the altar. Elena was lying on the ground, unconscious. Rushed to her side, shaking her gently, opened her eyes slowly, and gasped, "I saw him." He saw what he was never really my husband, not fully. Something entered him long before I left, and it followed. Keanu helped her sit up. The music box was vanished from the altar. They sat in silence as the forest around them began to breathe again. Keanu whispered, "We're not done a bit. We're closing." As they walked back toward the house, the wind shifted again, and from behind the trees, the sewn-mouthed man watched. But his eyes no longer burned. They wept, and for the first time looked afraid. The tears of the shadow man. Morning after the ritual, the forest around the cottage felt quieter, not peaceful, but tired, like it had been holding its breath for too long and was now slowly letting go. KeanuReeves helped Elena back inside the house, her steps weak, her body still shaking from whatever she had seen in that trance. He made her tea and sat across from her at the small wooden table. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally Elena broke the silence. "I felt him inside my head. His memories were pieces, shards of things that didn't belong together. He used to be someone else, someone good, until something whispered to him in the dark." Keanu leaned forward. "What did it say?" Elena closed her eyes for a moment and whispered, "Bring her to me again, and again bring her to me." Keanu sat back slowly. "So he wasn't the shadow, was its servant?" Elena nodded. "The man who once loved me became the vessel for something older. Didn't just follow me because he was angry. I followed me because he had promised me to something." Keanu looked out the window into the fading mist. "Then we need to find that something and end it." That afternoon they returned to Martha. The bookstore was closed, but the back door was open. Keanu knocked and stepped inside. Martha was sitting at her kitchen table, her hands trembling, her eyes wet with fear. "You brought something back," she said. Keanu frowned. "What do you mean?" Martha pointed to her living room wall. It was covered in handprints, dark and smudged like ash, but they weren't made with paint. They had appeared overnight, and Each one pointed toward a photo of Elena that Martha had kept from the research the. Want her, Martha whispered. Keanu helped her clean the wall. And then a sketto, you know how to finish it. Martha hesitated, then opened a small locked box from her shelf. Inside was a book with pages bound in bark and thread. This is older than anything I've ever used. It tells the story of the weeper forest spirit that latches onto grief. It marks people through pain and feeds on it. Keanu asked, how do we destroy it? Martha said softly, you don't you release it, you give it what it wants, must, but not in the way it expects. Keanu stared at her confused. It wants Elena, right? Then Martha nodded, yes, but not to kill Herto, keep Herto, trap her in memory, and Elena must face it on her own and forgive it. Keanu's jaw clenched. Shed no fight, burn it, wend it. Martha looked at him, you Ray brave Keanu, but some things aren't meant to be beaten, some things must be released. They returned to the cottage before sunset. Elena stood by the mirror combing her hair in silence. Keanu told her what Martha had said. Elena didn't flinch, nodded slowly. Think I already knew. Keanu walked to her. You're not doing this alone, but Elena took his hand and said, this part I must. That night she walked alone into the forest. Keanu followed at a distance, watching from behind the trees. She returned to the altar place where it had all started, and there it waste weeper no longer hiding in shadows, its true form now fully visible under the moonlight. Its face was blank, its eyes hollow, one tears like smoke ran down its cheeks. Elena stepped into the circle and whispered, remember you came when I was weak, you whispered, when I creed you promised peace and gave me pain, but I forgive Yahweh, release you cannot have me anymore, you cannot hold my memories like chains. I am not yours, I am free. The weeper didn't move at first, but then it tilted its head, its tears slowed into sound escaped its mouth. Not a growl, not a whisper, but a sigh, a long sad sigh that echoed through the forest. Keanu stepped forward just in time to see the weeper lower its head to the ground and melt into the soil like ash into fresh. Forest groaned and then fell silent. Elena collapsed. Keanu rushed to her, lifted her into his arms and carried her back through the woods. She slept for 2 full days. When she woke up, her eyes were clear. The music box was gone. The cameras no longer blinked. Trees outside stood still. There was peace for the first time. Keanu made them breakfast and they ate quietly at the table. Elena looked at him and said, you saved me. Keanu smiled softly. No, you saved yourself. But the moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. A normal knock, not soft, not slow, just 3 quick raps. Keanu opened the door. A mailman stood holding a small package. Return address. Inside was a photo, the same photo from the box. Elena as a child, but this time there was someone standing beside her, a woman with long dark hair and the same hollow eyes as the weeper. Elena stared at it, her hands trembling. Think she was my mother? Keanu frowned. Your mother? Elena nodded. She disappeared when I was 5. Everyone thought she ran away, but maybe she did it. Maybe the forest took her first. Keanu said, then we still don't know the whole story. Elena whispered, nah, but now we're ready to find Itas. They stared at the photo. The candle on the table flickered on. Sephan went out, not from wine but from something else. Something watching, something waiting. The last whisper. Next morning brought a heavy stillness to the cottage. It wasn't fear, it wasn't peace, it was something in between. KeanuReeves sat at the edge of the porch, his eyes locked on the trees as if he could still feel their breath even when they were quiet inside. Elena sat at the kitchen table staring at the photography. Woman beside her younger self looked like her, but older, sad and distant, same hollow eyes as the creature they had fastened. Elena whispered softly to herself, I didn't remember her face until no. Keanu stepped inside, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Maybe it was never a forest spirit, maybe it was here, a memory twisted by grief. And Elena looked at him, tears forming in her eyes. What if she was trying to protect Muhad? If the darkness didn't take her, what if she became it to shield me? Keanu nodded, quiet. Lithan, it means everything we've seen was not just evil, it was love buried under sorrow. That evening they returned to the altar in the forest one last time. Elena carried the photo in her hands the same way she once carried paint. They stood in the clearing under the canopy of stars. No wind, no creatures, just silence. She placed the photo in the center of the circle and said in a soft voice, if you are still here, if there is anything left of Yahweh, forgive. Yahweh was too young to understand why you left, but now I do release you. I can rest. No. She lit a single candle and placed it next to the photo. Flame flickered gently and bent sideways like a breath had passed through. Keanu and Elena watched as the photo slowly curled at the edges, then turned to ash. From deep within the forest came a soft sound, a whisper, not words, just peace of kind, that wraps around the soul like a blanket. Keanu and Elena turned back toward the path, but as they walked away something unexpected happened. A shape began to form where the photo had brunette, a woman's figure clothed in light and mist, looked just like the one in the photograph. Stood still watching them. Gotham slowly turned and stepped into the trees, never looking back. Next day, Keanu helped Elena pack her things. The cottage had served its purpose. It was no longer a home, but a place of memory, a place that had given up its ghost. He moved to a small house in town near the bookstore where Martha now kept Elena's photo on the front shelf beside old journals and books of forgotten tales. Elena started painting again, at the kind of painting she used to do when everything was dark but light, bold strokes filled with warmth, painted forests not with shadows but with sunlight. Keanu visited of sometimes for tea, sometimes just to sit in silence. Never asked her what she dreamed anymore. He knew, and she no longer woke up crying. Nightmares were going on. Afternoon, as they walked by the river, Elena turned to him and said, "Oh, you think she's really gonna?" Keanu smiled softly. "No, I think she's home wherever that is." Elena nodded and said, "So are we." Weeks passed and spring returned. Flowers bloomed where the altar once stood. Birds nested in the trees that once hid eyes of fire. Peace was no longer a wish, it was real. Lonely day, Elena received a letter, no return address. Inside was a small charm, a pendant she hadn't seen since she was a child. Her mother used to wear it. With it came a note written in delicate handwriting. "Thank you for remembering me." Elena held the pendant to her chest, and for the first time in years, she smiled without far. Keanu returned to his quiet life, still helping, still listening, but something had changed in him too. Had gone to fix a sink and ended up healing a island. Maybe even his own, because kindness has no finish line, and sometimes the smallest acts become the start of something no one sees coming. Gunnel at Dust Forest no longer was spread, but if it ever did again, KeanuReeves would be ready